High above the Pacific, beneath a ceiling of boiling cloud, Japanese fighters cruised in calm confidence, believing the storm beneath them was a shield. Then, without warning, dark shapes tore straight up through the clouds, American fighters climbing vertically out of nothing. In seconds, shock replaced certainty in the sky. What happened next shattered every rule of air combat Japan trusted. If you want to witness the moment the clouds betrayed them, like, subscribe, and stay with this story. By the time American fighters began rising unseen through cloud and storm, the Pacific sky had already witnessed two very different wars. In December 1941, the Japanese Empire ruled the air with speed, discipline, and experience. At Pearl Harbor, waves of carrier-based aircraft struck with a precision the world had never seen. Across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, Japanese pilots swept through Allied defenses almost unchallenged. Their main weapon was not just the aircraft they flew, but the men who flew them. Many were veterans of years of combat over China. They had perfected aggressive dogfighting tactics built on instinct, vision, and coordination. The Mitsubishi A6M0, light and maneuverable, became the symbol of that early dominance. At altitude, in clear sky, it could outturn almost anything sent against it. For the first year of the war, clouds favored Japan. American pilots entered the Pacific Air War at a disadvantage. They arrived with aircraft still being adapted for tropical combat, limited radar coordination, and tactics borrowed from a European sky very different from the sprawling ocean battlefield. Early engagements exposed weakness after weakness. Fighters lacked armor. Fuel tanks ignited too easily. Pilots were brave, but green. The price of learning was paid in burning aircraft and sinking ships. Then came 1942. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway did not instantly give the United States control of the air, but they broke Japan's belief in its own invincibility. At Midway, Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed in a matter of hours. With them went irreplaceable aircrew, men whose experience could not be rebuilt quickly. Guadalcanal followed, and with it, months of grinding aerial combat over jungle, sea, and shallow cloud banks. Both sides bled, but the losses were not equal. The United States could replace aircraft, engines, and pilots. Japan could not. Yet even as the strategic balance began to tilt, the sky itself remained contested territory. The vast Pacific created weather that shifted by the hour. Towering cumulonimbus clouds rose 10, 15, 20,000 feet into the air. Visibility vanished without warning. Rain curtains erased formations in seconds. For Japanese pilots trained to fight by sight alone, clouds were still protection, natural walls that blinded the enemy and preserved escape routes above the storms. American commanders understood this weakness long before it could be fully exploited. By 1943, a silent race was underway, not just to build faster fighters, but to see through the sky itself. Shipborne radar sets had existed early in the war, but their reliability and integration were limited. Now they improved rapidly. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers were fitted with increasingly precise air search radar. Ground stations across newly captured islands extended detection hundreds of miles outward. For the first time in aerial warfare, aircraft no longer depended solely on human eyesight to find the enemy. Controllers could now guide fighters into empty portions of sky where danger waited unseen. Above, new American aircraft were arriving in the Pacific in strength. The F-6F Hellcat replaced earlier naval fighters and immediately proved more durable, faster, and better armed. The F-4U Corsair, once too dangerous for carrier decks, was tamed and unleashed with overwhelming power. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning began stalking Japanese aircraft at altitudes where older fighters struggled to operate. Beneath the metal and machinery lay new doctrine. American pilots were no longer trained to spiral endlessly with Japanese fighters in low-speed turning contests. They were taught to strike from altitude, dive with energy, fire once, and climb back into safety. But doctrine alone could not yet conquer the clouds. Even with better engines and stronger aircraft, the Pacific atmosphere still imposed its own rules. Updrafts tossed fighters like leaves. Icing threatened carburetors. Visibility vanished without warning. In these conditions, Japanese patrol doctrine remained rooted in the habits of the early war. Fighters often cruised above cloud tops in loose formations, believing the heavy weather below insulated them from sudden attack. They trusted that an enemy would have to break through layers of turbulent cloud one by one, losing speed and surprise long before reaching them. That belief would soon be tested. By late 1943 and into 1944, American air power expanded across the Central Pacific. Island by island, new airstrips appeared. Radar stations rose on coral outcroppings that only months earlier had been empty sand. Carrier task forces learned to operate as floating radar networks, their aircraft linked not just by radio but by an invisible lattice of electromagnetic detection reaching far beyond the horizon. Each advance shortened the distance between discovery and interception. For Japanese commanders, the war in the air now carried a new and frightening uncertainty. Aircraft sometimes vanished without ever seeing an enemy. Fighters rising from cloud layers encountered attackers already in firing position. Pilots reported the sensation of being hunted by an opponent they could not see until bullets were already passing their canopies. The weather had not changed. The sky was still filled with towering cloud and unpredictable storm. What had changed was who possessed the ability to use that sky without being blinded by it. By the time Japanese squadrons took to the heavens on the morning when American fighters would rise straight through the storm, the Pacific Air War had already passed a point of no return. The balance was no longer measured only in aircraft and pilots. It was now measured in who could see first, climb first, and strike from inside the weather itself. And on that morning, high above the cloud ceiling, two different beliefs about the sky were about to collide. By 1943, the American rise in the Pacific was no longer measured only in ships and soldiers. It was measured in horsepower, electronics, and the quiet transformation of how pilots were taught to fight the sky itself. At the heart of the change lay the American aircraft engine. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp became the mechanical foundation of a new generation of fighters. With more than 2,000 horsepower driving heavy airframes upward at previously unreachable rates, vertical space became an American advantage. The engine's durability meant pilots could climb hard, stay high longer, and escape just as violently as they attacked. Power was no longer rationed. It was imposed. Wrapped around that power were new aircraft designed not for elegance, but for survival and dominance. The F-6F Hellcat carried armor that absorbed punishment the Zero could not survive. It mounted 6.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of tearing apart a light fighter in a single pass. The F-4U Corsair brought even more speed and climb, its inverted gull wings housing an engine that could propel it upward like a launched projectile. The P-38 Lightning added range and altitude to the equation, escorting bombers and hunting patrols far above weather layers once considered unreachable. But metal alone did not explain why American fighters began to rise unseen through cloud where Japanese pilots believed no threat could follow. That transformation came from radar. Early in the war, radar had been an experimental tool, awkward, unreliable, misunderstood. By 1944, it was the invisible spine of American air warfare. Carrier groups became floating sensor fields. Destroyers extended detection screens far beyond the carriers themselves. On captured islands, radar towers rose above jungles and beaches, watching the sky day and night. Aircraft were no longer launched blindly into open air. They were guided, vectored, and positioned with mathematical precision. From dark operations rooms deep inside carriers, radar officers tracked faint contacts across glowing screens. Blips became formations. Speeds became intentions. Incoming patrols were identified long before they crossed the edge of human vision. Controllers did not simply warn of attack anymore. They directed it. This was the crucial difference. American fighters were no longer reacting to enemy aircraft after visual contact. They were being delivered invisibly into perfect attack positions, often from below, from behind, or straight through weather layers that once guaranteed safety. To exploit this advantage, training had to change as well. The United States built a pilot production system unmatched in scale. Thousands of aviators passed through standardized schools where tactics were not learned by instinct alone but by repetition, simulation, and doctrine. Pilots flew blind on instruments. They trained in cloud. They learned to trust radios and vector instructions over their own uncertain sight. Gunners practiced deflection shooting until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Every procedure, from interception to disengagement, became systematic. Japan could not match this transformation. Japanese pilot training had once been elite, selective, and brutally thorough. But by 1943, that system was collapsing under casualty rates it had never been designed to absorb. Veteran pilots died faster than they could be replaced. Training hours were cut. Fuel shortages limited flight practice. New pilots entered combat with a fraction of the experience their predecessors possessed. More dangerously, their doctrine remained tied to visual combat and clear sky maneuvering. Cloud still meant concealment. Instruments were not trusted. Radar was fragmented and primitive by comparison. The sky above storms was still treated as sanctuary. American pilots now trained specifically to violate that sanctuary. Climb doctrines emphasized energy retention over turning finesse. Fighters were taught to rise at full power into blind cloud layers guided only by instruments and the calm voice of a controller many miles away. They learned to trust altimeters over instinct, compass over horizon. Inside cloud, there were no reference points, only vibration, strain, and the relentless pull of gravity fighting against climbing engines. When they emerged from the cloud tops, the reward was altitude, position, and surprise. This method did not seek to outturn the enemy. It sought to appear where the enemy was never supposed to be reached. By late 1944, this system had matured into a fully integrated weapon. Radar detection initiated the kill chain. Controllers shaped the intercept. Engines supplied the vertical reach. Armored aircraft absorbed return fire. And pilots, trained to trust invisible guidance, delivered strikes with mechanical precision. Japanese pilots began to notice the change in fragments. Patrols vanished without warning. Escorts were ambushed before bombers could be sighted. Fighters were attacked from angles that violated decades of visual combat rules. Reports spoke of American aircraft rising out of cloud like shadows given metal, appearing without the scream of a distant dive. But doctrine is faster to build than belief. Some Japanese squadrons attempted to adapt, flying lower, scattering formations, avoiding weather where instrumental guidance might turn the sky against them. Others clung to the old logic. Clouds were still considered shields. Altitude still meant control. Surprise still belonged to the pilot who saw first with human eyes. They underestimated what it meant to fight an enemy who no longer relied on eyes alone. By the time radar operators guided American fighters upward through dense cloud layers on the morning of the interception, every technical piece of the new air war had already been assembled. The engines were ready. The pilots were trained. The weather was no longer neutral. And somewhere above the cloud ceiling, a Japanese patrol was flying in confidence shaped by an older sky. Long before engines met in the clouds, the battle had already begun inside the minds of the pilots. For Japanese aviators, the sky had once been a place of inherited confidence. Before the war, naval flight training was among the most demanding in the world. Only a fraction of candidates ever earned their wings. Those who did carried years of refinement in aerobatics, navigation, and gunnery. They learned to feel the air as much as see it. By 1941, many frontline pilots had already survived dozens of combat missions over China. When the Pacific War opened, they did not merely fight the sky, they commanded it. But confidence is a fragile thing when it is built on irreplaceable experience. By 1943, the veteran core of Japanese air power was thinning at an irreversible rate. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, each campaign consumed another layer of trained aviators. For those who remained, the cockpits grew lonelier. Familiar voices disappeared from radio calls. Pre-flight briefings grew quieter. New pilots arrived with fewer hours, less weather training, and little exposure to coordinated interception. The machines were still dangerous, but the human mastery behind them was fading. American pilots, meanwhile, were entering the war under very different emotional conditions. Most arrived without the mystical reputation carried by Japanese aces. They were not told they were elite. They were told they were part of a system. Their confidence did not come from personal legend. It came from procedure. They trusted their aircraft to bring them home. They trusted their wingmen to hold formation. And increasingly, they trusted unseen radar operators who never flew but saw farther than any pilot ever could. This trust reshaped fear itself. Early in the war, American aviators feared turning contests with the zero, feared sudden ambush from sun-blinded horizons, feared the vastness of the Pacific swallowing down pilots without rescue. By late 1944, a different anxiety emerged. They feared losing radio contact. They feared drifting outside radar coverage. The enemy was no longer a silhouette in open sky, it was something detected long before it was visible. Fear became quieter, colder, more abstract. Japanese fear evolved in the opposite direction. Patrol flights once felt predictable. Weather provided cover. Altitude provided safety. In clear air, the enemy could be seen coming. By the later stages of the war, that predictability vanished. Pilots climbed above cloud layers not with comfort but with caution. They trusted instruments they had never fully mastered. They searched for movement across empty cloud tops that stretched in every direction without reference. Then reports began to circulate. American fighters emerging suddenly from beneath cloud layers. Escorts attacked from blind vertical angles. Aircraft destroyed before a turn could even be attempted. The sky itself seemed to betray them. Every mission now carried an invisible question: was the enemy already climbing toward them through cloud they believed impassable? Psychological distance widened between the two sides. American pilots spoke increasingly of control. They climbed knowing they were expected at a specific vector, at a specific altitude, at a specific time where radar predicted the enemy would arrive. The sky became organized, compartmentalized, almost mechanical. Japanese pilots began to experience the opposite. The sky felt less ordered with every patrol. Altitude no longer guaranteed safety. Weather no longer guaranteed concealment. The old rules of engagement dissolved without explanation. Encounters felt sudden, unfair, unnatural. There was no warning scream of diving engines, only brief flashes of muzzle fire and the violent tremor of impact. Even survival carried weight. American pilots often returned to carriers or forward strips where fresh aircraft waited. Debriefings were systematic. Losses were recorded, analyzed, compensated for. The war continued with procedural continuity. Japanese survivors often returned to shrinking bases where replacement aircraft were delayed, parts were scarce, and the list of absent comrades grew longer with each sortie. Confidence for one side became institutional. For the other, it became personal and fragile. And yet, on both sides of the Pacific, on both sides of the cloud ceiling, the mental burden was shared in one crucial way. Every pilot who climbed that morning climbed knowing that once inside the weather, vision would vanish. Judgment would narrow to instruments, engine vibration, and the thin invisible thread of radio contact. Inside cloud, rank disappeared. Experience narrowed. Fear became equal. The difference was what waited above. For American pilots, the cloud was a corridor into advantage. For Japanese pilots, the cloud was still believed to be a wall. That belief would not survive the day. The morning that would redefine the meaning of cloud cover began without violence. Over the western Pacific, a dense weather system moved slowly across open water and scattered island chains. Warm ocean air surged upward, feeding towering cloud columns that stacked layer upon layer into the upper atmosphere. From the surface, the sky appeared sealed shut, an unbroken ceiling of gray stretching to the horizon. Above it, sunlight still ruled. Clear air waited at altitude. For Japanese patrol planners, it looked like a familiar shield. Shortly after dawn, a Japanese fighter section lifted off from a forward base guarding an exposed maritime approach. Fuel shortages had reduced patrol cycles, but air cover was still required. The mission was routine: climb above the heavy cloud deck, establish a wide altitude screen, and monitor for incoming threats. The assumption remained unchanged even in late war: enemy aircraft would have to break through the clouds from below and reveal themselves long before reaching patrol height. The climb was steady, engines laboring through humid turbulence. Moisture-streaked canopies. For long minutes, pilots saw nothing but shifting gray and the round needles of their altimeters. Then, one by one, they emerged into clean upper air above the storm. The cloud tops lay beneath them like a rolling white ocean, reshaped by wind but seemingly solid. Sunlight glinted across wing surfaces. Formation spacing tightened. Radios crackled with routine status calls. Above the clouds, the sky felt empty and safe. Below that same cloud ceiling, far beyond the range of human sight, a different process had already begun. Hundreds of miles away, aboard an American carrier task group maneuvering quietly into favorable wind, radar operators had detected faint contacts near the edge of their screens. At first, the blips were indistinct, small returns drifting against sea clutter and atmospheric interference. But as the contacts held course and altitude, the picture sharpened. Speed, direction, and probable identity were calculated in minutes. Within the carrier's combat information center, the sky was no longer invisible. Orders moved without drama. A fighter squadron already on standby received vectors and climb instructions almost immediately. Engines roared to life across the flight deck. One by one, American fighters lifted into the gray below the cloud layer and disappeared from view within seconds. Once inside the weather, the pilots could see nothing beyond the smooth curvature of their instrument panels and the faint ghost of their own wing tips vanishing into vapor. Radio guidance replaced eyesight. Controllers fed altitude, bearing, and climb rates in exact increments. Pilots held full power, trusting engine temperatures, carburetor pressures, and the voice in their headsets. The climb was punishing. Ice threatened the air intakes. Turbulence hammered control surfaces. Without horizon or visual reference, every correction was made by instrument alone. The fighters rose steadily, unseen and unheard by the patrol above. For the Japanese pilots, the cloud tops below remained undisturbed. From their vantage point, the atmosphere appeared inert. No contrails pierced the white field. No glints of reflected sunlight betrayed climbing opponents. Their own fuel gauges ticked down as they maintained patrol altitude in gentle arcs, scanning empty blue sky for threats that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. This false calm carried authority because it had worked before. Earlier in the war, American fighters had struggled to penetrate heavy cloud without losing cohesion or surprise. Climbing blindly wasted fuel and exposed aircraft to disorientation. The enemy usually emerged scattered and easily detected as they broke through cloud tops. That memory still guided Japanese expectations. But underneath the storm, the American climb continued without interruption. Engines strained at combat power. Altimeter needles swept upward through the final 1,000 feet separating blind ascent from unobstructed air. Pilots tightened formation using only instrument alignment and radio cue. The voices guiding them remained calm and perfectly detached. To the controllers, the intercept was geometry. To the pilots, it was trust made mechanical. At the precise altitude bracket where Japanese patrol Doctrine placed fighters for maximum visibility above weather, the American climb neared its final stage. Inside the cockpits, the light began to change. The gray that had enveloped the aircraft for long minutes thinned into luminous haze. Vapor brightened. Edges sharpened. With a last surge of power, the leading fighters pierced the upper boundary of the cloud layer. Sunlight flooded cockpits in an instant. The white ocean of cloud dropped away beneath them, and the clear blue of high altitude opened in all directions. Above them, completely exposed against the empty sky, Japanese fighters cruised in loose formation, exactly where radar had predicted. For a fraction of a second, neither side moved. The American pilots had emerged directly beneath their targets, close enough to see markings, close enough to read the shapes of wings and canopies. Surprise had not come from speed or angle. It had come from impossibility. The enemy was not supposed to be there. And in that frozen instant, above an ocean of cloud that had just failed as a shield, the sky paused, balanced on the edge of violence that would unfold in seconds. Above them, completely exposed against the empty sky, Japanese fighters cruised in loose formation, exactly where radar had predicted. For a fraction of a second, neither side moved. The American pilots had emerged directly beneath their targets, close enough to see markings, close enough to read the shapes of wings and canopies. Surprise had not come from speed or angle. It had come from impossibility. The enemy was not supposed to be there. And in that frozen instant, above an ocean of cloud that had just failed as a shield, the sky paused, balanced on the edge of violence that would unfold in seconds. Japanese pilots now fought two enemies at once, the Americans in the open air above, and the cloud itself below. Diving into cloud meant instant loss of visual reference. Climbing meant exposure to attackers who already owned the upper sky. Those who tried to level off at the cloud boundary found themselves silhouetted against white backgrounds that erased their camouflage and turned them into aiming points. A few attempted escape by extending away at full power. But the American fighters, already carrying altitude advantage from the vertical intercept, simply followed in shallow dives that closed distance faster than the Japanese engines could generate separation. In several cases, Japanese pilots did not realize they were pursued until rounds struck their tail surfaces. One by one, the patrol disintegrated into solitary aircraft fighting for survival rather than formation integrity. There was no prolonged dogfight in the classical sense. The encounter lacked the long spirals and drawn-out turning engagements that had defined earlier air battles of the Pacific. Instead, it unfolded as a rapid sequence of vertical strikes, short, violent, final. Each pass lasted seconds. Each decision carried irreversible consequence. For American pilots, training took over completely. They did not chase blindly into cloud. They broke away when radios instructed. They climbed when engines and instruments commanded. The weather that once represented danger now functioned as controlled terrain, entered only deliberately, exited with precision. For Japanese pilots, the rules they had mastered no longer applied. Several pilots attempted a desperate regroup above the cloud tops after surviving initial attacks. They formed a loose defensive circle, hoping collective fire might repel further assaults. But the Americans did not approach horizontally. They struck from staggered vertical offsets, crossing the formation center of defense faster than guns could be reoriented. One aircraft at the top of the circle absorbed the first burst. Another on the opposite side fell seconds later. The defensive ring became a scatter of independent evasions. Within minutes, the patrol ceased to exist as a functional force. Smoke trails decorated the once empty upper sky. The cloud blanket below flickered with the shadows of falling aircraft. American fighters continued to cycle through their attack pattern with methodical discipline until no organized opposition remained above them. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the Americans disengaged. One by one, they slipped back into the cloud layer along controlled descent paths broadcast by radar. The white field swallowed them whole. From the perspective of any surviving Japanese pilot, the enemy vanished exactly as impossibly as it had arrived, rising from nothing, striking with unbearable precision, then dissolving back into the weather without visible retreat. The sky above the storm fell quiet again. Wreckage and vapor drifted where formations had flown moments earlier. The sunlight remained unchanged. The cloud deck still stretched endlessly beneath empty blue. But the atmosphere itself no longer felt neutral. In a matter of minutes, a belief that had guided years of Pacific Air Patrol doctrine had been disproven in full view of those who depended upon it. Clouds were no longer shields. Altitude was no longer sanctuary. Vision was no longer the supreme authority of the fight. When the last American fighter disappeared into the vapor below, the cloud ceiling did not close behind a battle. It closed behind a lesson. In the minutes after the last American fighter vanished back into the cloud, the upper sky returned to a deceptive stillness. But the silence masked the scale of what had just occurred. Several Japanese aircraft had failed to return from patrol. Others limped back toward their base alone, fuel gauges near empty, control surfaces damaged, engines vibrating with wounds they could not hide. There were no formations to reform. No escort structure to reassemble. Each survivor arrived independently, carrying the same unspoken realization: the cloud had betrayed them. Japanese ground crews watched aircraft land with unfamiliar damage patterns. Bullet strikes clustered along fuselage tops and wing roots told a story no one expected to hear. Pilots reported attacks from directly below, emerging without warning from dense cloud. The accounts contradicted every assumption that had governed patrol altitude doctrine for years. At command levels, the shock deepened. Intercept reports confirmed what survivors could scarcely articulate: American fighters had climbed unseen through weather layers once thought impassable and achieved immediate firing position at altitude. This was not an isolated incident. Similar radar-guided vertical interceptions were being reported across multiple Pacific sectors by late 1944. Enemy patrol patterns were being penetrated with surgical accuracy. For American task forces, the engagement was recorded as a clean, efficient intercept. Radar logs showed the detection window, vector path, climb profile, attack duration, and disengagement timeline with exact mathematical order. Aircraft losses on the American side were minimal. Ammunition expenditure was modest. Fuel consumption remained within projected operational limits. The sky had been controlled exactly as planned. That precision had consequences far beyond the single patrol destroyed above the storm. Japanese commanders began ordering patrol altitudes lowered to avoid vertical interception. But flying lower brought new dangers: anti-aircraft fire from advancing Allied positions, reduced radar horizon, and increased vulnerability to boom and zoom attacks from American fighters descending from higher altitudes still under radar guidance. Some squadrons began dispersing wider during patrols to reduce vulnerability to concentrated attacks. But dispersion only made mutual defense weaker against coordinated radar-directed strikes. The air war entered a new psychological phase. Japanese pilots no longer trusted the weather. Cloud cover, once a refuge, became a source of unease. Every formation now wondered what might already be climbing invisibly beneath them. Patrols grew shorter. Climb profiles became hesitant. Fuel was conserved for escape rather than pursuit. The initiative in the sky shifted silently but decisively. For American pilots, the engagement reinforced confidence in systems rather than individual heroics. Success was not attributed to daring maneuver or personal marksmanship alone. It was tied to radar detection, to disciplined climb profiles, to controllers whose voices remained steady even while battles unfolded at invisible distances from their screens. This reinforced an operational mindset that would dominate the remainder of the Pacific Air Campaign. Victory would come not from outflying the enemy in clear sky, but from outseeing them in all weather. Strategically, this shift tightened the aerial chokehold around Japanese logistics. Bombing raids now moved with increasing escort protection at altitudes once considered dangerous. Japanese interceptors struggled to predict approach vectors as radar allowed American formations to change direction within cloud with near invisibility. Attrition mounted in fragments, single fighters lost here, patrols broken there, never in one catastrophic collapse, but steadily enough to hollow the air defense network. For Japanese pilots, the sense of isolation intensified. They no longer fought an enemy whose approach could be visually tracked from horizon to horizon. They fought an adversary delivered by unseen calculation. The uncertainty of where danger might emerge became as exhausting as combat itself. Survivors of the cloud-top interception carried that uncertainty forward. Reports circulated through units in cautious language, but the message was unmistakable: the enemy could now rise through weather as if the storm itself opened pathways for them. This altered behavior in subtle ways. Pilots spent more time scanning empty cloud tops instead of open sky. They questioned altitudes once deemed ideal. They hesitated where decisiveness once ruled. Each hesitation cost seconds. And in air combat measured in seconds, hesitation was not neutral, it was lethal. For American forces, the storm that morning became a quiet confirmation rather than a celebrated victory. No headlines followed. No dramatic announcements pierced the operational routine. It was catalogued as one more successful demonstration of what radar-guided vertical interception could achieve. But in the pattern of the Pacific Air War, it marked a line that could not be recrossed. The sky after that day was no longer divided simply into clear and cloud. It was divided into detected and undetected, controlled and vulnerable, seen and unseen. And no side understood that distinction more clearly than the pilots who had believed the clouds would always protect them. For most of human history, weather had been an equalizer in war. Storms halted fleets. Fog blinded armies. Cloud hid the vulnerable and shielded the outmatched. In the skies of the early 20th century, that ancient rule still seemed to hold. Pilots learned to read the atmosphere as carefully as they read maps. Cloud meant danger, but also concealment. Nature still dictated the boundaries of battle. The interception above the Pacific storm shattered that balance. What unfolded that morning was not just a tactical victory. It was a transformation in how the sky itself was understood. For the first time in sustained aerial warfare, weather ceased to be an impartial force. It became terrain that could be entered, measured, and controlled through instruments rather than eyesight. The cloud was no longer a wall. It became a corridor. This shift reshaped the remainder of the Pacific Air War. From that point forward, altitude alone no longer defined advantage. Visibility no longer belonged to the pilot with the sharper eyes. It belonged to the side that could see without seeing, through radar pulses, radio vectors, and the cold geometry of detection screens. The invisible began to outweigh the visible. For American air power, this marked the full maturity of a new kind of warfare. Mechanical reliability, standardized training, and integrated technology merged into a single operational organism. Individual courage still mattered, but it was now nested inside a larger system that extended far beyond any cockpit. Pilots became the final instruments of an unseen process that began long before they ever touched their flight controls. For Japan, the lesson arrived too late and at too high a cost. Their air doctrine had been built on mastery of the visible sky, on turning, instinct, and personal engagement. It produced extraordinary pilots in the early war. But it could not adapt fast enough to a battlefield where the enemy no longer had to be seen to be deadly. When the clouds stopped serving as refuge, the foundations of that doctrine collapsed quietly, one patrol at a time. In the decades that followed, the meaning of that change only deepened. Modern air warfare would be shaped not by who climbed highest in clear air, but by who could dominate the invisible spectrum, radar, radio, electronic detection, and beyond. Missiles would replace guns. Screens would replace horizons. The pilot's world would expand far past the edges of the canopy. Yet the core truth revealed that morning remains unchanged. Battlefields are not only made of land and sea. They are made of belief. And when belief in the sky itself is broken, the consequences ripple far beyond a single engagement. The clouds that once promised safety now carry a different meaning, one forged in the moment American fighters rose straight through the storm and proved that even the weather could be mastered. Above the Pacific, the clouds still roam as they always have. They still gather, rise, and dissolve with silent indifference to human conflict. But after that day, they no longer belong to nature alone.